The fluorescent lights of the 15th floor hummed with a predatory energy, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to burrow directly into Elias Thorne's skull. It was 9:45 p.m., though time had long since lost its linear meaning. For Elias, life was measured in lines of code, database queries, and the rhythmic, shallow breathing of the 8-month-old infant currently sleeping in a portable bassinet tucked beneath a vacant desk nearby. Elias was a senior systems architect at Ethelgard, a multi-billion-dollar titan of the San Francisco tech scene. To the outside world, Ethelgard was a beacon of innovation, a glass and steel cathedral of progress. To Elias, it was a pressure cooker. He was currently drowning in a legacy system integration that was hemorrhaging errors. Every time he patched a leak in the API, 3 more sprung up in the data structure. The delivery deadline was a guillotine hanging 5 hours away. If the demo failed tomorrow morning, the sales team would incinerate the engineering department, and Elias, already teetering on the edge of burnout, would likely find himself on the next quarterly layoff spreadsheet. His son, Leo, was the only thing keeping him tethered to his humanity. Since the death of his wife, Clara, on an operating table 8 months ago, Elias had become a ghost haunting his own life. Clara had been the vibrant one, the anchor. Without her, Elias was just a man trying to raise a child who refused to eat. Leo had spent the better part of his short life rejecting every hypoallergenic formula, every specialized bottle, and every nutritional supplement the pediatricians could suggest. He was a failure to thrive. Statistic in the making, his weight percentiles dropping toward a danger zone. That kept Elias awake with a cold, gnawing terror every night. Ethelgard's engineering floor had become Leo's de facto nursery. The team had embraced him as an unofficial mascot. He was passed from developer to developer, cradled by UX designers while they sketched wireframes, and entertained by junior coders during their coffee breaks. It was a chaotic, communal form of parenting that allowed Elias to keep his job while keeping his son alive. Around 9:15 p.m., a junior developer named Julian had wandered past Elias's desk. "Hey, Elias, just so you know, Elena took Leo up to the 20th floor. Said she'd watch him for a bit while you finish that query." The information registered at the very surface of Elias's brain. Elena Vance, the CEO of Ethelgard, taking his son upstairs? It was an absurdity. Elena was the Iron Maiden of Silicon Valley. She was the woman who had fired 400 people via a recorded memo during a Series D crunch. She was a woman of sharp angles, charcoal Armani suits, and a Bunsen burner stare that made board members tremble. She didn't do small talk, she didn't attend happy hours, and she certainly didn't babysit. But Elias was deep in the zone, a psychological trenches where only logic and syntax existed. He nodded absently, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. He assumed Julian had misspoken or that Elena's executive assistant had taken the baby. 10 minutes passed. 20. 30. When the logic of the code finally broke, a breakthrough that should have felt like a victory, Elias leaned back, his eyes burning. He looked toward the bassinet. Empty. He looked toward Julian's desk. "Hey, where's Leo?" "Like I said, the boss took him," Julian replied, not looking up from his monitor. "She walked right up to me, picked him up while he was fussing, and headed for the executive elevator." Dread, cold and sudden, spiked through Elias's chest. Elena Vance didn't just pick up babies. He stood up, his chair clattering against the floor. He hurried toward the elevator bank, but the executive lift required a biometric keycard he didn't possess. Without thinking, he sprinted for the stairwell. 5 flights of stairs felt like a mountain. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from the exertion, but from a growing, irrational certainty that something had gone fundamentally wrong. The 20th floor was sacred ground. It was the realm of mahogany conference tables, acquisition deals, and the kind of silence that only extreme wealth can buy. When Elias burst through the heavy fire doors of the 20th floor, the reception area was ghost white and empty. The executive assistant was gone for the night. The silence here was a physical weight, a stark contrast to the caffeinated hum of the engineering floor below. He followed a faint sound, a rhythmic, soft hushing, toward the executive break room at the far end of the hall. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open, his brain prepared for a dozen scenarios. Leo crying in a corner, Elena looking frustrated with a screaming infant, or perhaps a nanny he hadn't known about. Instead, his mind simply refused to process the scene unfolding 3 feet in front of him. Elena Vance sat in a deep leather recliner positioned by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The lights of the Bay Bridge twinkled behind her like a fallen constellation. Her charcoal blazer was draped carelessly over the armrest. Her silk blouse was unbuttoned, pulled aside to reveal a vulnerability Elias couldn't reconcile with the woman who graced the covers of Forbes. Leo was nestled against her chest. He was nursing. The sound in the room was primal, the soft, wet rhythm of a hungry infant finally finding peace. Leo's small, pudgy hands were clutched at the fabric of Elena's blouse with a desperate, ancient familiarity. He wasn't fussing. He wasn't rejecting a plastic nipple. He was latching on with an intensity that sent a shiver of ice through Elias's veins. Elias stood frozen in the doorway. The laws of his professional world had just been rewritten. This was the CEO of a $3 billion company. This was his boss, and she was breastfeeding his son. Elena's eyes lifted slowly. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away or try to cover herself in a panic. She looked at him with a gaze that was raw, shattered, and utterly devoid of the corporate armor she wore like a second skin. Tears were streaming down her face in thick, silent lines, carving through her expensive makeup and pooling at her jawline. The expression she wore was one Elias had never seen on her, a mixture of agonizing grief and absolute, visceral need. Her lips barely moved. Her voice was a broken whisper that barely carried over the sound of the baby's contentment. "Please," she breathed. "Close the door. Lock it. I forgot to lock it." Elias's hand found the handle through muscle memory alone. The click of the lock echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He leaned his back against the wood, his conscious mind still 3 steps behind what his eyes were reporting. The world had condensed to this impossible tableau. For 8 months, Elias had watched his son waste away, rejecting every artificial substitute the modern world could offer. He had watched Leo scream until his face was purple, pushing away bottles as if they were poison. Now he watched his son drift into a state of boneless satisfaction, anchored to a woman who was supposed to be a stranger. How? Elias managed to choke out. The word felt like it was made of glass. How? Is this even happening? Elena took a shuddering breath, her hand cupped behind Leo's head, supporting him with a practiced, instinctive grace. "Let him finish," she said, her voice trembling but gaining a sliver of its usual command. "Please, let him finish. Then I'll explain everything. I promise. I'll explain." Elias slid down the door until he was sitting on the polished hardwood floor. He felt like a voyeur in a sacred space, yet he couldn't look away. He watched the woman he had feared for 2 years transform. She wasn't an ice queen here. She was a woman whose body was reacting to a call it had been designed to answer. The minutes stretched, becoming elastic and strange. Elias thought of his wife, Clara. He thought of the empty nursery in his apartment. He thought of the HR manuals and the ethics seminars and the professional boundaries that were currently being incinerated. But mostly, he thought of Leo. For the first time in 8 months, Leo looked okay. Not just okay, but thriving. Finally, Leo's nursing slowed. His small body relaxed completely, falling into the deep, heavy sleep of a satiated infant. Elena adjusted her hold, her movements economical and tender. She used her free hand to fix her blouse, her movements unself-conscious, as if the moment of exposure had been rendered irrelevant by the magnitude of what had just occurred. She looked down at the sleeping boy, then back at Elias. The silence between them was no longer the silence of the 20th floor. It was the silence of 2 people standing in the ruins of their own lives. "I lost my daughter last week," Elena said. The words were flat, dead, yet they hit Elias like a physical blow. Her name was Maya. I was 18 weeks pregnant. This was the 4th time, Elias. For pregnancies. For losses. each one taking a little more of whatever hope I had left. The revelation recontextualized everything Elias knew about her. The Iron Maiden hadn't been cold, she had been armored. She had been carrying a weight of grief that would have crushed a lesser person, all while navigating the shark-infested waters of Silicon Valley. Nobody knew, she continued, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I've spent 6 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars on IVF, specialists, and therapies. My body, it prepares for a child that never arrives. It produces milk for a daughter I'll never hold. When I picked up Leo tonight, when I heard him crying in that specific way, that hunger that hits the bone, something happened. Something I couldn't control. She looked at Elias with a haunting vulnerability. The oxytocin flooded my system so fast I felt dizzy. My breasts let down. Elias, right there in the middle of the engineering floor. I saw him rooting against Julian's shoulder. And I acted on instinct. I brought him up here. I locked the door. And I gave him what he was asking for. Elias looked at his son. Leo's face was serene, his breathing deep and regular. The pediatrician has been worried about his weight, Elias said softly. He rejects everything. I thought I was going to lose him, too. He didn't reject me, Elena whispered. He knew exactly what he needed. She stood up with visible effort, her legs seemingly shaky. She crossed the room and carefully transferred the sleeping Leo into Elias's arms. The loss that crossed her face as the baby left her embrace was so profound that Elias had to look away. I know what this looks like, Elena said, stepping back and pulling her blazer over her shoulders, the CEO mask beginning to slide back into place, though it was now cracked and translucent. I know it's a violation. I know it's a scandal. If you want to call HR, if you want to call a lawyer, I won't fight you. But please, just look at him. Elias looked down at Leo. The baby felt heavier, more substantial, as if those 30 minutes had added density to his frame. He thought about the deadline. Downstairs, the billion-dollar company, and the 8 layers of management. Between him and this woman, none of it mattered. I'm not calling anyone, Elias said, his voice steady for the first time that night. I have a pediatrician appointment at 2 p.m. tomorrow. He was supposed to be checked for a feeding tube. Elena nodded, a single, sharp movement. Tell the doctor the truth. Or don't. But know that, if he needs it again, I am here. Elias stood up, cradling his son. He looked at the woman who had just saved his child's life with an act of desperate, grieving grace. The 20th floor was still silent, still cold, still regal. But as Elias turned to leave, he realized that the world he had walked into 20 minutes ago no longer existed. The Iron Maiden was gone, and in her place was a woman who, like him, was just trying to survive the wreckage of her heart. Thank you, Elena, he whispered. She didn't answer. She only turned back to the window, watching the fog roll in. Over the bay, a solitary figure in a glass tower, waiting for a morning that felt both terrifying and, for the first time, possible. The morning following the encounter on the 20th floor did not arrive with the clarity of a new dawn. Instead, it filtered through the gray, heavy curtains of Elias Thorne's Mission District apartment like a bruised confession. Elias sat at the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, listening to the rhythmic, whistling breath of Leo in the crib. For the first time in months, the baby hadn't woken up screaming at 3 a.m. For the first time since Clara's funeral. The crushing weight of, what if he starves today, hadn't been the first thought to claw at Elias's consciousness. But in its place was a different kind of weight, the surreal, tectonic shift of his reality. Elena Vance, the woman whose name was synonymous with ruthless corporate efficiency, had become a ghost in his mind, her silk blouse unbuttoned, her eyes brimming with a grief so ancient it felt like it belonged to another century. He looked at his phone. There were no emails from her, no Slack messages, no summons to HR. The corporate machinery of Ethelgard was humming along as if the laws of physics hadn't been shattered the night before. Elias dressed. Mechanically, his movements stiff. He packed Leo's diaper bag with the usual frantic precision, but as he reached for the expensive, specialized formula, the One that cost nearly $300 a case and smelled like metallic chalk. His hand hesitated. He left it on the counter. The drive to Dr. Sterling's office was a blur of San Francisco traffic, the colorful murals of the Mission District flashing past like a fever dream. Dr. Sterling was a man of 80-year-old wisdom and 30-year-old energy, a pediatrician who had seen Elias through the darkest months of his life. In the examination room, the silence was broken only by the crinkle of the sanitary paper on the table. Dr. Sterling performed the weigh-in with his usual methodical quiet. He stared at the scale, then at the chart on his tablet, then back at the scale. "He's up 6 ounces since Tuesday," Sterling said, his voice carrying a note of profound suspicion. 6 ounces in 48 hours, Elias. After 3 months of stagnant growth. What changed? Elias felt the air in the room grow thin. He looked at Leo, who was currently gumming a silicone ring, his eyes bright and alert, far from the listless infant of the previous week. "I found a supplemental source," Elias said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. Dr. Sterling removed his glasses and polished them. "A supplemental source? You mean a donor? Or did you finally find a formula he doesn't vomit?" "Actual milk," Elias said, leaning forward. He didn't say her name. He couldn't. A woman. Someone who. She recently lost her child. Spontaneous lactation. She held him, and he latched. "He nursed for 35 minutes, Dr. Sterling. He didn't struggle. He didn't pull away. He ate." The doctor was silent for a long time. The medical world was built on sterile solutions and FDA-approved alternatives, but the history of humanity was built on something much messier. Spontaneous lactation triggered by proximity to an infant in distress, Sterling mused. "It's rare, but the biological imperative is a powerful thing. If the woman is healthy, and I'd want her screened." Elias. "Then from a purely clinical standpoint, this is the miracle we've been waiting for. This child was heading toward a feeding tube. If his body is finally accepting nutrition, I don't care if it comes from a bottle or a stranger." "She's not a stranger," Elias whispered. "She's my boss." Sterling's eyebrows shot up, but he didn't laugh. He saw the terror in Elias's eyes. "Then you are in a very complicated, very human predicament. My advice? Follow the health of the child. Look at his skin. Look at his eyes. He's thriving because of whatever happened last night. But Elias, be careful. Grief and hormones are a volatile cocktail." Elias left the clinic feeling as if he were walking on a tightrope. He went back to the office, but he avoided the 15th floor, opting instead to work from a quiet corner of the cafeteria. He watched the executive elevator out of the corner of his eye. At 4 p.m., a notification pinged on his laptop. It was an encrypted email from an unlisted internal address. "My office. 6 p.m. The floor will be cleared." The 2 hours leading up to the meeting felt like an eternity. When Elias finally stepped onto the 20th floor, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the glass walls in hues of fire and gold. Elena was standing at the window, exactly where he had left her. She had changed into a different suit, a deep navy that made her look even more like a statue carved from midnight. "How was the appointment?" she asked, her back still toward him. "He gained 6 ounces, Elias replied. She turned then, and for a fleeting second, the Iron Maiden mask slipped. A look of pure, unadulterated joy crossed her face before being tucked away. 6 ounces. That's wonderful. The doctor says it's what saved him from a feeding tube," Elias added. "But he also said the arrangement is complicated." Elena walked toward her desk, her movements stiff. She picked up a heavy fountain pen, turning it over in her fingers. "I spent the day looking at his files, Elias. Not the HR files. The ones you left on the server, the insurance claims for his specialists. I saw the struggle. I saw what you've been through since your wife died." She paused, her voice catching. "I can't go back to how it was. I spent the morning in a board meeting, and all I could feel was the phantom weight of him against my chest. My body, it hasn't stopped. It won't stop." She looked at him with an intensity that was almost frightening. "I want to continue. Not here. Not in this building. I can't have the board or the press. Knowing that Elena Vance is moonlighted as a wet nurse, it would destroy the company's valuation and my reputation. But I need to do this. For him. And God. Help me, for myself. Elias looked at her, searching for the catch, the corporate angle. But all he saw was a mother whose arms were empty and a woman who had finally found a purpose for her pain. My apartment, Elias said. It's in the Mission. It's small. It's a mess. But it's private. No security cameras. No executive assistants. Elena nodded. 6:30. Every evening. I'll vary my route. I'll come through the back entrance of your building. We keep this between us. Total professional. Distance at the office. No special treatment for you. No acknowledgement of this sanctuary. Sanctuary, Elias repeated. The word felt right. The first evening Elena arrived at the Mission District Apartment was a study in jarring contrasts. Elias had spent an hour trying to clear the baby debris from his living room, the stacks of laundry, the discarded toys, the half-empty coffee mugs. The apartment was a walk up, the air smelling of the nearby taqueria and the salty Pacific breeze. When the knock came, Elias opened the door to find a woman he barely recognized. She had traded the Armani suit for dark leggings and an oversized cashmere sweater. Her hair, usually pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful, was down, falling in dark waves over her shoulders. She looked younger, softer, and profoundly nervous. Is he awake? She asked, her voice low. He's been fussing for 20 minutes, Elias said, stepping aside. I think he knows. Elena walked into the small living room. She didn't comment on the worn velvet sofa or the cracked plaster on the ceiling. She went straight to Leo, who was sitting in a plastic bouncer, his face beginning to scrunch up in a prelude to a cry. The moment she picked him up, he went silent. He tucked his head into the crook of her neck, let out a long, shuddering sigh, and began to root. Elias moved to the kitchen to give them space, but the apartment was too small for true distance. He busied himself making tea, the clink of the spoon against the ceramic the only sound in the room. He looked over the counter and saw Elena, sitting in the old rocking chair Clara had bought at a flea market. She had settled into the rhythm of it with a grace that felt ancient. As Leo nursed, the tension seemed to bleed out of her. The sharp, predatory energy of the CEO was replaced by a quiet, focused devotion. I haven't been in an apartment like this in 20 years, Elena said softly, her eyes on the baby. My first startup, we lived in a place half this size. We slept on the floor and coded until our eyes bled. We thought that was the hardest thing we'd ever do. She let out a dry, hollow laugh. We had no idea. Elias sat at the small kitchen table, watching them. Clara used to sit in that chair. She used to talk to him when he was still inside her. She had all these plans. She wanted him to be a musician. She'd play cello recordings against her stomach. Elena looked up, her expression sympathetic. She sounds like she was a beautiful person. She was everything, Elias said, his voice thick. When she died, the world it lost its color. And then Leo started failing, and I realized I was failing him. I've spent 8 months feeling like I was drowning in a glass box, and everyone was just watching me from the outside. I know that box, Elena whispered. I've lived in it for 6 years. Every miscarriage was a new layer of glass. You keep performing, keep hitting the targets, keep making the millions, because if you stop, the glass shatters and you have to face the fact that you're empty. She looked down at Leo, who had fallen into a deep sleep, his mouth still slightly open. He's not empty. He's so full of life, Elias. He just needed someone to bridge the gap. For the next 2 weeks, the Mission District Apartment became the secret center of their lives. At Ethelgard, they were strangers. Elena would pass Elias in the hall, and her eyes would be like flint, her voice barking orders to her subordinates. Elias would sit at his desk, his fingers flying across the keys, his mind a fortress of code. But at 6:30 p.m., the masks would drop. The secret sanctuary began to change them. Elena started bringing things, not expensive gifts, but practical ones. High-quality organic groceries, soft muslin, swaddles, books on infant development. She would help Elias with the dishes, while he told her about his day, the frustrations of the legacy system, the office politics. In turn, she told him about the pressures of the board, the loneliness of leadership, and the daughter, Maya, she would never know. They were two people from different worlds, bound together by a biological necessity and a shared language of loss. One evening, as Leo was drifting off, Elena looked around the room. You need to move, Elias. Elias paused, a dish towel in his hand. What? Not because this place isn't enough, she said quickly, but because you're still living in a museum of Clara's life. Every corner of this apartment is a reminder of what you lost. It's beautiful, but it's heavy. You and Leo, you need space to breathe. Space that belongs to the two of you. I can't afford a breathing space in this city, Elena, Elias said with a faint smile. I'm a senior engineer, but San Francisco real estate is designed for people like you, not people like me. Elena stood up, carefully laying the sleeping Leo in his crib. She walked over to Elias, her presence commanding even in her casual clothes. Then let me help. Not as your boss, as whatever this is. We agreed, Elias said firmly. No special treatment. No corporate entanglement. This isn't corporate, she countered. This is survival. You're raising a child who is finally growing. He needs a yard. He needs sunlight. And you need to stop punishing yourself by living in the past. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of professional friction and a new, burgeoning intimacy that neither was ready to name. I'll think about it, Elias conceded. As Elena prepared to leave that night, she paused at the door. She looked back at the small, cluttered apartment, at the rocking chair, and then at Elias. I told the board today that I'm taking a step back from the day-to-day operations. For a while, I told them I'm consulting more and managing less. Elias felt a pang of guilt. Because of this? Because of me, she corrected. For the first time in a decade, I don't want to be in the tower, Elias. I want to be here. Or somewhere like here. I want to feel the weight of something real. She reached out, her hand hovering near his arm for a second before she pulled it back. See you tomorrow, Elias. See you tomorrow, Elena. As her car pulled away into the Mission District night, Elias stood by the window. He looked at his son, who was thriving. He looked at the empty spot on the sofa where Elena had sat. The secret sanctuary was no longer just about feeding a baby. It was about two broken people finding a way to knit their souls back together in the quiet dark of a city that never stopped moving. And as the fog rolled in, Elias realized he wasn't drowning anymore. For the first time in 8 months, he was swimming toward the shore. The glass and steel expanse of Ethelgard had always felt like a sterile, predictable ecosystem. There were predators, there were prey, and there were the systems that governed them both. But for Elias Thorne, the fortress was beginning to feel like a house of mirrors. Every time he sat in a scrum meeting, or stood in the communal kitchen waiting for the industrial espresso machine to hiss, he felt the weight of the secret he carried in his lungs. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into their arrangement, and the 15th floor was buzzing with a peculiar energy. The legacy system integration Elias had been wrestling with was finally stable, a feat that should have earned him a celebratory lunch or at least a public nod from the CTO. But Elias found he couldn't care about the code. His eyes kept drifting to the executive elevator. The brushed aluminum doors a silent barrier between his cubicle and the woman, who, less than 12 hours ago, had been humming a low lullaby while sitting on his faded velvet sofa. In the office, Elena Vance was a force of nature. She walked through the corridors with a stride that demanded the air itself get out of her way. Her hair was back in its signature, gravity-defying bun, her face a mask of impenetrable focus. When she passed Elias's desk during a routine walkthrough with the board of directors, she didn't even blink. She was discussing Q4 projection models with a voice like sharpened flint. To anyone watching, Elias was just another high-performing asset, a senior architect whose recent productivity spike was surely the result of a fresh surge of professional ambition. Nobody knew that the ambition was actually the profound relief of a father who no longer had to count the ribs on his son's chest every morning. She's been different lately, hasn't she? Elias jumped, nearly spilling his coffee. Julian, the junior developer who had inadvertently started this entire saga, was leaning against the partition of Elias's cubicle, squinting toward the executive wing. Who? Elias asked, his voice a fraction too high. The boss. Elena, Julian said, oblivious. Usually, when the board is in town. She's a nightmare. Last year, she made a VP of sales cry in the break room because his margins were off by 2%. But today, she's still sharp, but she's not bleeding. There's a weird kind of stillness about her. Maybe she finally took a vacation. Elias forced a dry laugh. Maybe she's human, Julian, even if she doesn't act like it. I don't know, Julian mused. Sometimes I think she's a highly advanced AI, designed to maximize shareholder value. But hey, if she's chilling out, I'm not complaining. Maybe I'll actually survive my performance review. As Julian wandered off, Elias felt a cold sweat prickle his neck. The erosion was starting. It wasn't just happening in his apartment. It was leaking into the atmosphere of Ethelgard. Elena was softening, and in an environment built on the myth of her invulnerability, even a slight change in pressure was being recorded by the office barometers. That afternoon, Elias was summoned to a high-level architectural review on the 20th floor. It wasn't an unusual request. He was the lead on the integration, but the air in the conference room felt different. There were 6 people present: the CTO, 2 senior VPs, and Elena. She was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, silhouetted against the San Francisco skyline. As Elias laid out the data structures and the new API endpoints, he felt her gaze on him. It wasn't the predatory stare of a CEO looking for a flaw. It was something heavier, something more personal. He stumbled over a sentence, a simple explanation of a database query, because for a split second, he looked at her and didn't see the suit or the Bunsen burner eyes. He saw the way she had looked last night, her cashmere sweater stained with a bit of Leo's spit up, her face tired but peaceful. Thorn, the CTO prompted, frowning. You were saying about the latency issues, right? Sorry, Elias said, snapping back. The latency is mitigated by the new caching layer. We've seen a 40% improvement in response times. Good, Elena said. Her voice was steady, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, recognition, perhaps, or a warning. Make sure the documentation is as clean as the code, Elias. We can't afford any ambiguity in the handover. The use of his first name was a slip. It was subtle. In Silicon Valley, first names were the norm, but Elena Vance rarely used them. She usually referred to people by their surnames or their titles. The VPs didn't seem to notice, but the CTO glanced at her, his head tilting slightly. Elias finished the presentation and practically fled the room. He realized then that the secret sanctuary was a lie. There was no such thing as a sanctuary. When you were living a double life, the boundaries weren't being eroded. They were being dissolved by the sheer heat of their shared reality. At 6:30 p.m., the familiar knock echoed through his Mission District apartment. When he opened the door, Elena didn't say hello. She walked past him, her face tight with a tension he didn't recognize. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red. She went straight to the crib, where Leo was waking up from a nap. The board meeting was a disaster, she said, her voice trembling as she scooped the baby into her arms. Julian said you were doing great, Elias said, closing the door and leaning against it. He said you were still and not bleeding. Elena let out a harsh, jagged breath. I was performing, Elias. But inside I was counting the minutes until I could get out of that building. They were talking about human capital and redundancy strategies, and all I could think about was the fact that my daughter is a pile of ashes in a marble urn and your son is the only thing that makes my body feel like it isn't a tomb. She sat in the rocking chair, her movements frantic as she unbuttoned her sweater. Leo, sensing her distress, began to fuss, but as soon as he latched, a profound silence descended on the room. Elias watched her. The erosion was complete. He wasn't looking at his CEO anymore. He was looking at a woman who was bleeding out from 1,000 invisible wounds. He walked over to the kitchen and began to prepare dinner, a simple pasta dish with garlic and oil. You can't keep doing this, Elena, he said softly, his back to her. Doing what? Living two lives. It's starting to show. People are noticing. Julian, the CTO, you're too good at your job to be this visible. I don't care about the job, she whispered. Elias turned around, the wooden spoon in his hand. You have to care. You're the CEO of Ethelgard. If this gets out, if the board thinks there's a conflict of interest, or if they find out about this, they will destroy you. They'll call it an abuse of power. They'll say I'm a victim or a co-conspirator. They'll take everything you've built. Elena looked at him, her eyes fierce. Let them. I've built $1 billion company, Elias. I've made people millions. And for what? So I can sit in a penthouse in Pacific Heights and listen to the silence of 4 empty bedrooms. She looked down at Leo, her expression softening into something heartbreaking. This boy, he gave me a reason to wake up that isn't a quarterly earnings report. If the price of that is my career, then the career was overpriced. Elias walked over and sat on the coffee table in front of her. The professional distance he had fought to maintain was gone. He reached out, a tentative, terrifying movement, and placed his hand on her knee. It's not just your career, Elena. It's mine. And it's Leo's future. We have to be smart. She covered his hand with hers. Her skin was warm, a stark contrast to the cold glass of the 20th floor. I know we have to be smart. But Elias, I'm so tired of being smart. I've been the smartest person in every room for 20 years. I just want to be human for an hour. They sat there in the fading light of the Mission District, the only sounds the ticking of the clock and the rhythmic breathing of a child who was finally thriving. As the days passed, the domestic rhythm deepened. Elena stopped being a visitor and started being a presence. She knew where Elias kept the extra towels. She knew which floorboards squeaked near the bathroom. She knew that Elias liked his coffee black and that he often forgot to eat when he was deep in a project. She began to stay later. After Leo fell into his deep, milk-drunk sleep, they would sit on the velvet sofa and talk. Not about code or projections, but about the things people talk about when they are trying to build a bridge across an abyss. She told him about her childhood in Detroit, the daughter of a high school teacher and a librarian who didn't understand her ambition. She told him about the first time she realized she was different, that she could see the logic of markets the way other people saw the colors of a sunset. Elias told her about Clara, not just the tragedy of her death, but the small things, the way she used to hum in her sleep, the way she could never find her keys, the way she believed that every problem in the world could be solved with a good bowl of soup and a long walk. I think she would have liked you, Elias said one night, his voice low. Elena looked at him, a half smile on her lips. I think she would have been terrified of me. Everyone is, Elias. I'm not, he said, and he realized it was true. The Iron Maiden was a costume. The woman sitting next to him, her feet tucked under her, a stray lock of hair falling across her face, was someone else entirely. The shift happened on a rainy Friday. The fog had swallowed the city, turning the mission into a world of muffled sounds and hazy lights. Elena had arrived, late, looking shaken. One of the board members, Marcus, he saw me leaving the parking garage. Through the service exit, she said, pacing the small living room. He didn't say anything, but I saw his face. He's suspicious, Elias. He's already been gunning for a leadership change. If he starts digging, then we stop, Elias said, though the thought felt like a hollow ache in his chest. We go to Expressed Milk. You can pump, you can send it via courier. We remove the physical contact. Elena stopped pacing. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a flash of anger. Is that what you want? To turn this back into a transaction? To turn Leo into a project? No, Elias shouted, standing up. It's not what I want. But I can't watch you fall, Elena. I can't be the reason you lose everything you've bled for. You're not the reason. She stepped toward him, her voice rising. I am. I'm the one who can't let go. I'm the one who needs this more than he does. They were inches apart, the air between them electric with grief, fear, and a desperate, burgeoning hunger that had nothing to do with milk or code. Elena, don't, she whispered. Don't tell me to be smart, Elias. Not tonight. She reached out, her hands finding the collar of his shirt, and pulled him toward her. The kiss was desperate, a collision of two people who had been starved of connection for so long that they didn't know how to be gentle. It tasted of salt, tears, and the rainy San Francisco night. In that moment, the 20th floor, the legacy system, the board of directors, and the quarterly layoffs vanished. There was only the warmth of her body, the smell of her skin, and the crushing realization that the boundaries weren't just eroded, they were gone. They broke apart, both of them breathing hard, the silence of the apartment suddenly deafening. "This is a disaster," Elias breathed, his forehead resting against hers. "Yes," Elena whispered, her hands still clutching his shirt. "A complete, utter disaster. What are we going to do?" Elena pulled back, her eyes clearing, the CEO's tactical mind finally re-engaging, but this time, it was working for them. "We do what I've always done," she said, her voice regaining its steel. "We control the narrative. We prepare for the fallout. And we protect what's ours." She looked toward the crib, where Leo was sleeping, oblivious to the fact that his father and his savior had just declared war on the world they lived in. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start looking for that new house. The one with the yard. The one with the privacy. If Marcus is digging, we make sure he finds nothing but a ghost." As she left that night, she didn't look back. But Elias stood at the window, watching her car disappear into the fog, and he knew that the secret sanctuary was about to become a fortress. They had crossed the final line, and there was no going back to the safety of the mirrors. They were in the real world now, and the real world was a dangerous place for people who loved too much and had too much to lose. The storm that had been brewing in the shadowed corners of Ethelgard finally broke on a Tuesday morning, not with a roar, but with the synchronized chime of 1,000 smartphone notifications. Elias was in the kitchen of his Mission District apartment, carefully testing the temperature of a puree he'd made for Leo. The transition to solid foods was supposed to be a milestone of celebration, a sign that Leo was becoming more independent. But as the TechCrunch alert flashed across his screen, the spoon clattered into the sink. The headline was a serrated blade, the Iron Maiden secret, Ethelgard CEO, spotted in late-night trysts with subordinate. Beneath the headline were a series of graining, long-lens photographs. There was Elena, draped in an oversized sweater, entering the rear service door of Elias's apartment building at 6:45 p.m. There was Elena leaving at 9 p.m., her face partially obscured by a scarf, but her silhouette unmistakable. The article was a masterpiece of corporate prurience. It didn't mention Leo. It didn't know about the nursing or the grief or the secret sanctuary. It filled the vacuum of knowledge with the most sordid, predictable assumptions, an abuse of power, a predatory executive, a breach of every ethical boundary in the Ethelgard handbook. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He looked at Leo, who was banging a plastic cup against his high chair, oblivious to the fact that his world was being dismantled in real time. His phone buzzed. It was a text from an unlisted number, Elena's private line. "Do not come to the office. Stay inside. I am handling it." Elias ignored her. He couldn't stay in the cage of his apartment while she faced the wolves alone. He strapped Leo into the car seat, grabbed the oversized diaper bag, now a survival kit, and drove toward the glass tower in downtown San Francisco. The atmosphere at Ethelgard had shifted from professional to predatory. Groups of engineers were huddled around monitors, their voices a low, discordant hum of gossip. As Elias walked toward his cubicle on the 15th floor, the silence followed him like a physical wake. People he had worked with for years, Julian, the UX team, the QA leads, looked away or stared with a cold, newfound curiosity. He was no longer the grieving widower or the talented architect. He was the subordinate in the headline, the man who had supposedly slept his way into a stable legacy integration. He didn't make it to his desk. Marcus, the board member who had been circling Elena like a shark for months, was standing by the elevators. He was flanked by two members of the legal team. "Mr. Thorne," Marcus said, his voice dripping with a practiced, lethal concern. "The board is currently in an emergency session with Ms. Vance. It would be best if you waited in the small conference room on 20. For your own protection? Of course. I don't need protection, Elias said, his grip tightening on Leo's carrier. I need to see her. That is exactly what you cannot do, Marcus replied. Elias was escorted to the 20th floor, but not to the executive break room. He was placed in a windowless room, a sterile box of white light and silence. He sat there for 2 hours, feeding Leo the puree, his mind racing through every possible catastrophe. He thought about the board's ultimatum. He knew how these things worked. They would demand a confession, a public apology, and his immediate termination. They would demand Elena distance herself from the scandal to protect the stock price. What he didn't expect was the notification that hit his phone at 10 a.m. Mandatory all-hands meeting. Auditorium. 10:15 a.m. Elias stood up. He didn't wait for permission. He pushed past the junior lawyer, stationed outside the door, and headed for the auditorium. The room was packed. 1,500 employees were squeezed into the tiered seating, a sea of faces illuminated by the blue light of their devices. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and anxiety. Elias found a spot in the very back row, tucking Leo's carrier against his chest. Elena walked onto the stage at exactly 10:15. She wasn't wearing the navy sweater or the leggings of the mission. She was back in the armor, a charcoal Armani suit, her hair pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her face into a mask of iron. But as she stood behind the mahogany podium, Elias saw her knuckles turn white as she gripped the wood. She looked out at the sea of employees, the people who feared her, the people who admired her, and the people who were currently judging her. Many of you have seen the reports circulating this morning, Elena began. Her voice was projected through the massive speaker system, a cold, clear resonance that demanded silence. The photographs and the speculation regarding my private conduct and my relationship with an employee of this company. A collective breath seemed to be held in the room. The board of directors has spent the last 2 hours asking me for a narrative that fits the corporate handbook, Elena continued, her voice gaining a dangerous edge. They wanted a story of a lapse in judgment. They wanted a resignation and a non-disclosure agreement. They wanted to protect the valuation of Ethelgard by burying the truth in a shallow grave of PR-approved lies. She paused, and for the first time, her eyes scanned the very back of the room. She found Elias. I have spent 20 years building this company, she said, her voice softening. Just a fraction. I have fired people to protect our margins. I have closed deals that moved markets. I have been called the Iron Maiden because I was willing to sacrifice everything on the altar of professional achievement. But 4 months ago, my world collapsed. The auditorium was so silent that Elias could hear the soft whir of the ventilation system. I lost my daughter, Maya, at 18 weeks, Elena said. The confession was a physical blow to the room. The Iron Maiden was bleeding in front of them. It was my 4th loss. And in the wake of that tragedy, my body did something that the board of directors cannot find a column for in an Excel spreadsheet. It produced milk. It prepared to sustain a life that no longer existed. She stepped out from behind the podium, standing in the center of the stage, vulnerable and immense. At the same time, one of our senior architects was losing his son, not to tragedy, but to a failure of nutrition. His 8-month-old child was starving, rejecting every artificial substitute the world could offer. When I held that child, my body didn't see a subordinate. It didn't see a conflict of interest. It saw a hungry infant. And I acted on an instinct that predates this company, this city, and the very concept of a corporate board. The gasp that rippled through the room was visceral. For the past several months, I have been nursing Elias Thorne's son, she said. Her voice now a steady, unbreakable steel. I have been his wet nurse. I have been his sanctuary. And he has been mine. There was no romance. There was no abuse of power. There was only a woman who lost her child trying to keep another woman's child alive. She looked directly at Marcus, who was sitting in the front row, his face a mask of purple-tinged fury. The board has given me an ultimatum, Elena said. They told me that if I did not end this arrangement and submit to a formal reprimand, they would remove me. For cause. They told me that the optics of a CEO breastfeeding an employee's child were incompatible with our brand. She let out a short, dry laugh that echoed like a snap of bone. I agree with them. The optics are incompatible because Ethelgard is built on the myth of the machine, and what I did was profoundly, stubbornly human. Therefore, I am not here to apologize. I am here to resign. The room erupted. Shouts, gasps, the frantic clicking of keyboards. But Elena didn't flinch. I am resigning as CEO of Ethelgard, effective immediately, she shouted over the din. I have built an empire of glass and steel, but I have realized that I would rather be a mother to a child who isn't mine than the queen of a company that has no heart. I am taking my shares, I am taking my experience, and I am going to build something else. Something that recognizes that we are more than just human capital. She looked back at the back row, her eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. To the person who took those photographs, thank you. You thought you were exposing a scandal. You were actually setting me free. She turned and walked off the stage. She didn't look back at the board. She didn't wait for the interim CEO to be named. Elias stood up, Leo heavy against his chest. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the stares and the cameras that were already being aimed at him. He sprinted for the executive elevators. He found her in her office, throwing a few personal items into a bag, a framed photo of her parents, a small wooden carving, and a silk swaddle that Leo had used. Elena, Elias breathed, closing the door behind him. She turned, and the mask finally shattered. She leaned against the mahogany desk and sobbed, her whole body shaking with the force of the release. Elias crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, Leo sandwiched between them. You gave it all up, Elias whispered into her hair. The billions, the title, everything. I didn't give up anything that mattered, she choked out, clutching the back of his shirt. I feel like I can finally breathe, Elias. For the first time in 6 years, I'm not waiting for the glass to shatter. I broke it myself. What do we do now? Elena pulled back, wiping her eyes, a familiar, tactical light returning to her gaze, but this time it was tempered with a profound peace. Now, she said, looking down at the sleeping Leo. Now we go home. We introduce him to those purees. And then we figure out how to build a world where a woman doesn't have to choose between her power and her humanity. As they walked out of the Ethelgard Tower for the last time, the sidewalk was swarmed with reporters and photographers. Flashbulbs strobed against the gray San Francisco sky. Elena didn't hide. She didn't look down. She gripped Elias's hand with one hand and shielded Leo with the other, walking through the gauntlet with the stride of a woman who had lost a kingdom and found her soul. The Iron Maiden was dead, and in the quiet of the Mission District that night, as the fog rolled in to cover the secret sanctuary, Elias realized that the sacrifice hadn't been a tragedy. It had been an invitation to finally start living. The 6 months following the resignation of Elena Vance were a blur of headlines, legal filings, and the quiet, rhythmic ticking of a life being rebuilt from the inside out. The media had initially treated the story as a tabloid feast, a fallen queen, a secret wet nurse arrangement, and the scandalous intersection of corporate power and biological intimacy. But as the sensationalism began to dry up, a more profound narrative took root. The Iron Maiden was gone, but in her place was a woman who was becoming the face of a new, radical transparency. Elena and Elias moved out of the Mission District, the apartment that had served as their secret sanctuary was beautiful in its tragedy, but it was, as Elena had noted, a museum of Elias's grief. With the liquidation of her initial Ethelgard shares, a fortune that remained vast despite the board's attempts to claw it back, Elena purchased a weathered, shingle-style house in the hills of Mill Valley. It was surrounded by redwoods and shrouded in the same fog that had once hidden them in the city, but here, the air tasted of salt and pine instead of exhaust and desperation. The house was large, but it didn't feel empty. It was filled with the chaos of a growing child. Leo was no longer the fragile, listless infant who had sparked this journey. At 14 months, He was a whirlwind of energy, a toddler who had survived his failure to thrive diagnosis to become a sturdy, laughing boy, with his father's eyes and a stubborn streak that Elena joked was her own biological contribution. Elias had taken a position at a smaller, mission-driven startup, a company that developed open-source educational software. He earned half of what he had made at Ethelgard, but he was home by 5 p.m. every day. He no longer coded until his eyes bled to satisfy a quarterly projection. He coded to build things that mattered, and he spent his evenings watching Elena and Leo in the yard. It was a Saturday morning, the light filtering through the redwoods and long, golden slanting rays, when Elena sat at the heavy oak table in their new kitchen, reviewing the charter for her new endeavor. "I've decided on the name," she said, her voice carrying a piece that Elias still occasionally found startling. "I'm calling it the Emma Maya Foundation." Elias paused in the middle of preparing Leo's breakfast. "Emma, my grandmother's name," Elena said softly. "But also, Emma means universal, and Maya means illusion. My daughter's life was short, an illusion of a future. I thought I was promised. But the grief, that was universal. I want the foundation to bridge that gap. I want to fund research into late-term pregnancy loss, but more than that, I want to create a network for milk sharing and wet nursing that isn't shrouded in shame. No woman should have to hide in a break room or a service entrance to save a child." The Emma Maya Foundation was Elena's new empire, but it was built on empathy rather than acquisition. She poured $200 million into its launch. Within weeks, she was no longer being invited to talk about disruptive tech. She was being invited to speak at medical conferences and human rights forums. She told the story of Leo, now with Elias's permission, not as a scandal, but as a testimony to the fact that biology doesn't care about organizational charts. The nursing had continued longer than either of them had expected. For Elena, her body had remained in a state of sustained lactation for nearly a year, a medical anomaly that Dr. Sterling attributed to the profound emotional bond she had formed with Leo. It was as if her body refused to stop providing until it was certain the child was safe. But the weaning process had begun naturally as Leo discovered the joys of solid food and the independence of walking. One evening, as the sun set behind the redwoods, Elena sat in the rocking chair, the one Clara had bought, which had moved with them to Mill Valley. Leo had nursed for only a few minutes before, pulling away, patting Elena's cheek with a sticky hand and pointing toward a wooden truck on the floor. Elena looked up at Elias, her eyes brimming with tears, but they weren't tears of grief. "I think we're done, Elias," she whispered. Elias walked over and knelt beside the chair. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. "He's strong enough to walk away now, Elena, because you gave him the strength." "It's strange," she said, leaning her head back. "I thought I'd feel empty when it stopped, like I was losing the only thing that made me a mother. But looking at him, I don't feel empty at all. I feel finished, like I finally completed a task I was given 6 years ago." The transition from a biological arrangement to a chosen family was the final, most quiet revolution of their lives. There had been no grand declaration of love during the months of the secret sanctuary. There had only been the steady, incremental building of trust. They had seen each other at their most broken, their most exposed. There were no masks left to wear. A week later, they drove to San Francisco City Hall. It was a simple ceremony, attended only by Elias's mother, who had flown in from the East Coast, and Julian, the only person from Ethelgard who had remained a true friend. Elena didn't wear charcoal Armani. She wore a simple, cream-colored silk dress, her hair loose and windblown. Elias wore the suit he had bought for his first interview at Ethelgard a lifetime ago. Leo, in a tiny corduroy jacket, stood between them, holding both their hands. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Elena didn't look at the cameras that were still occasionally following her. She looked at Elias, and then she picked up Leo, holding him against her hip with the ease of a woman who had found her place in the world. "We did it," Elias whispered as they walked down the stone steps into the cool San Francisco air. "No," Elena corrected, smiling at the toddler who was trying to grab her earring. "We started it." The following year was the first normal year Elias Thorne could remember. The Emma Maya Foundation became a global leader in maternal and infant health. Elena was often traveling, but she was never gone for long. She was a different kind of leader now, one who listened more than she spoke, one who wasn't afraid to show the cracks in her armor. Elias watched her grow into the role with a sense of awe. He remembered the woman on the 20th floor, the woman who had fired hundreds with a recording. That woman was a ghost. The woman he lived with was someone who spent her Saturday mornings teaching Leo how to plant tomatoes and her Sunday nights reading him stories about brave explorers and kind monsters. One morning, 18 months after the resignation, Elias woke up early. The house was quiet, the only sound the distant roar of the Pacific. He walked down the hall to Leo's room. The boy was fast asleep, sprawled across his bed with the total abandonment of the loved and the safe. He moved to the kitchen and found Elena already there. She was standing by the window, a mug of coffee in her hands, watching the deer move through the redwoods. She turned when he entered, her face radiant in the morning light. "Do you ever miss it?" Elias asked, leaning against the counter. "The power?" "The tower." Being the smartest person in the room, Elena walked over to him, resting her head against his chest. "Sometimes I miss the challenge," she admitted. "But then I remember the silence of that penthouse. And then I hear Leo waking up, or I see you looking at me like I'm actually a person instead of a projection, and I realize I was never powerful. Back then, Elias, I was just loud." She looked up at him, her eyes clear. "I'm powerful now because I don't have anything to hide. I'm powerful because I have a family that I chose, and a daughter I'll never forget, and a son who knows that his mother, both of his mothers, loved him enough to break the world for him." Elias kissed her forehead. He thought of Clara, and he felt a sense of peace. He realized that Clara would have loved this house. She would have loved the redwoods, and she would have loved the woman who had finished what she started. Leo's muffled shout came from down the hall, followed by the thump, thump, thump of small feet hitting the hardwood. "Mama, Papa, hunger." Elena laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the house. "The king is awake," she said, setting down her coffee, "and he demands his kingdom." As they moved together to meet their son, Elias realized that the story of the 20th floor was no longer a story of a scandal or a sacrifice. It was a story of a long, difficult birth, the birth of a family that had survived the fire and come out on the other side, not as glass and steel, but as something much more durable, a sanctuary built on the truth. The Iron Maiden was dead. Long live the mother.